Sometimes the worst inheritance turns out to be the greatest blessing. Clara Myles had lost her husband, her home, and nearly everything else when a lawyer handed her the deed to a worthless lake in West Virginia that nobody wanted. The locals called it Deadman's Hollow. Rusted barrels and rotting shacks surrounded the murky water like old gravestones. Clara saw only another burden, but her 7-year-old son Elias saw adventure. While she cleared brush and mended broken things, the boy explored the shoreline like a treasure hunter. One morning, his boots struck something metal beneath the water. Inside a sealed chest, he found old maps and records from 1883, records that revealed a secret worth $2 million. What Elias discovered would change their lives forever, but some treasures come with a deadly price. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months earlier, Clara Myles had been sitting in a cramped apartment above Murphy's diner in Charleston, counting coins on her kitchen table for the 3rd time that week. The numbers never changed. Not enough for rent, barely enough for groceries, and nothing left over for the shoes Elias needed or the school supplies that kept appearing on lists from his teacher. She twisted the simple gold band on her finger, a habit she'd developed since David's funeral. The ring had belonged to his grandmother, passed down through 3 generations of happier marriages than theirs had been toward the end. But it reminded her of the good years, when David still laughed at her terrible jokes and Elias was small, enough to fall asleep between them on Sunday mornings. Those days felt like someone else's life now. The knock on her door came at exactly 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon. Clara knew because she'd been watching the clock, calculating how many hours until she had to leave for her evening shift at the hospital. She worked in the laundry department, not glamorous work, but it paid regularly and came with health insurance that covered Elias when he got sick. The man at her door wore a suit that cost more than Clara made in 3 months. His business card read Thompson & Associates Estate Planning, and he carried a leather briefcase that smelled like money and old decisions. "Mrs. Myles, I'm here about your Uncle Jasper's estate." Clara stared at him. "I don't have an Uncle Jasper. Jasper Greyrock, your late husband's uncle?" The lawyer consulted his papers. "He passed away 6 weeks ago, left you some property in West Virginia." She invited him in because Elias was at school, and the neighbors didn't need to hear her business. The lawyer, Mr. Thompson, spread documents across her small kitchen table like he was dealing cards. Each page looked official and intimidating, stamped with seals and signed with flourishes. "Your husband never mentioned his uncle?" Thompson asked, adjusting his glasses. "David's family wasn't close. His parents died when he was young, and he was raised by his grandmother." Clara picked up one of the documents, trying to make sense of the legal language. "I'd never heard him mention any uncle." "Well, Jasper Greyrock owned 43 acres surrounding a small lake in Hancock County. He lived as something of a hermit, apparently, no other living relatives, and he specifically named you as his heir." Thompson pointed to a paragraph dense with "whereas and heretofore." The property includes the lake, several outbuildings, and a small residence. Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What's the catch?" Thompson smiled, not warmly. "No catch exactly. But I should mention the property has been on the market intermittently for 20 years. No buyers. The land isn't suitable. For farming, there's no road access except a dirt trail, and the lake has some sort of local reputation that makes people reluctant to purchase." "What kind of reputation?" "Something about an old mining accident, local folklore mostly. The point is, the property has virtually no market value. You could try to sell it, but nobody wants it." Clara set the papers down. "So this Uncle Jasper left me 40 acres of worthless swampland. I wouldn't call it worthless. It's land, and the taxes are current. Mr. Greyrock was quite conscientious about that. There's also a small trust fund established for maintenance. Nothing substantial, but enough to keep the county from seizing it for back taxes. After Thompson left, Clara sat at her kitchen table staring at the deed until Elias came home from school. He bounded through the door with grass stains on his knees and a crumpled permission slip for a field trip she couldn't afford. "Mum, what's all this paper?" She pulled him onto her lap, breathing in the scent of playground dust and little boy. "Sweat. We inherited some land, sweetheart, from your daddy's family." Elias's eyes widened. "Like a farm." "Sort of. It's got a lake. Can we go see it?" Clara looked around their cramped apartment, at the water stains spreading across the ceiling, at the kitchen faucet that dripped no matter how many times she asked the landlord to fix it, at the stack of overdue notices she'd been hiding from. Elias. Then she looked at her son's hopeful face and made a decision that surprised them both. "Pack your things, baby. We're going to West Virginia." The drive took them through mountain country that seemed forgotten by time. As they climbed higher into the hills, the radio stations faded to static and the cell phone towers disappeared. Clara followed the directions Thompson had provided, turning off increasingly smaller roads until they were bouncing along a rutted dirt track that barely deserved the name. "Are we lost?" Elias asked from the passenger seat, his nose pressed against the window. "I hope not." The trees closed in around them, thick oak and maple that blocked most of the afternoon sun. Clara had expected to feel claustrophobic, but instead found the shade oddly comforting. After years of city noise and exhaust fumes, the silence felt like a gift. They found the lake by accident. Clara missed the final turn Thompson had described, and the dirt road simply ended at a clearing. She parked the car, and they both climbed out, stretching legs cramped from hours of driving. "Oh," Elias whispered. Deadman's Hollow stretched before them like a dark mirror reflecting the overcast sky. It wasn't large, maybe 3 acres of water, surrounded by dense forest, but there was something about the stillness of it that made Clara catch her breath. The water was so dark she couldn't see the bottom, and the shoreline was littered with debris from some long-abandoned human presence. Rusted barrels lined the water's edge like sentinels. The remains of several small buildings dotted the clearing, most reduced to foundation stones and rotting timber, but one structure still stood intact enough to offer shelter. It had been a cabin once, built from rough-hewn logs that had weathered to silver grey. The roof sagged and several windows were broken, but the walls looked solid. "Is this ours?" Elias asked. Clara consulted the property description Thompson had given her. All of it, the lake, the buildings, everything you can see, and about 20 acres more beyond those trees. Elias ran toward the water's edge, and Clara's heart jumped. "Careful, baby. Stay away from the deep parts." But Elias had already discovered something that captured his attention completely. He knelt at the shoreline, poking at something half buried in the muddy sand with a stick he'd found. "Mom, look at all this old stuff." Clara walked over to see what he'd found. The debris field was more extensive than she'd first realized. Pieces of metal machinery stuck up from the shallow water like the bones of some mechanical beast. Glass. Bottles in various states of decay were scattered along the shore, some still intact, others reduced to smooth-edged fragments. And everywhere the rusted remnants of human activity, tools, pipes, unidentifiable metal objects, slowly being reclaimed by the earth. "What happened here?" Elias asked. Clara didn't have an answer. The silence felt heavy around them, as if the lake itself was holding secrets. She found herself studying the water, looking for some clue about why Uncle Jasper had lived here alone for so many years, why no one wanted to buy the property, why the locals called it Deadman's Hollow. "We should look at the cabin," she said. "See if it's livable." The interior of the cabin was better preserved than she'd expected. Someone, presumably Uncle Jasper, had maintained the basic structure, even if he'd neglected the cosmetic details. The floor was solid hardwood. The stone fireplace looked functional, and while the furniture was sparse and outdated, it appeared clean. Clara found Uncle Jasper's presence everywhere in small details. A coffee cup still sitting on the kitchen counter, half filled with something that had long since evolved into a science experiment. A pair of work boots by the door, sized for a man much larger than David had been. A shelf of books about local history, geology, and mining techniques. In the bedroom, she discovered clothes hanging in the closet, flannel shirts, work pants, a heavy coat that smelled of wood smoke and old tobacco. On the nightstand sat a photograph of a young couple she didn't recognize, dressed in clothes from maybe 40 years ago. The woman had Clara's nose and David's stubborn chin. "Mom, come look at this." Elias had found the back porch, where Uncle Jasper had apparently spent time watching the lake. An old rocking chair faced the water, and beside it sat a small table, covered with what looked like maps and documents. Clara gathered them up carefully. They seemed important, though she couldn't immediately understand why. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, Clara made a decision that would have terrified her 3 months ago. She found sheets in a cedar chest, made up the beds with linens that smelled of lavender and long storage, and began the process of making Deadman's Hollow their home. That first night, she lay awake listening to sounds she'd never heard before, the gentle lap of water against the shore, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the deep silence that only comes in places far from civilization. Beside her, Elias slept peacefully, one small hand curled around the flashlight he'd insisted on keeping nearby. For the first time in months, Clara felt something that might have been hope. Clara spent their first week at Deadman's Hollow in a fog of practical necessity. The cabin needed work, basic repairs that she tackled with tools she found in Uncle Jasper's shed, and determination born of having nowhere else to go. She patched holes in the roof with spare shingles, replaced broken window panes with cardboard and duct tape, and scrubbed years of bachelor neglect from every surface. Elias, meanwhile, treated their new home like the greatest adventure of his 7 years. While Clara worked inside, he explored the shoreline with the systematic thoroughness that only children possess. He collected interesting rocks, catalogued the various pieces of debris, and constructed elaborate theories about what had happened. At the lake in the mysterious past, "I think there were pirates here," he announced on their 3rd day, presenting Clara with a corroded piece of metal he'd dug from the shore. "This looks like part of a sword." Clara examined the rusted fragment. "I think it's probably from some old mining equipment, baby. This whole area used to be mining country." "Or it could be from a treasure chest," Elias said with the stubborn optimism of childhood. "Pirates always buried treasure by water." She ruffled his hair, amused by his imagination. "Sure, sweetheart, you keep looking." By the end of the week, Clara had established a routine. Mornings were for repairs and maintenance. Afternoons, she drove the winding mountain roads to the nearest town, a place called Fairmont, 20 miles away, where she'd found work at a small medical clinic. The pay wasn't much, but it covered their basic needs and gave her something to do while Elias explored their new world. The drive also provided opportunities to learn about their new community. At the gas station, the grocery store, the diner, where she sometimes stopped for coffee, Clara picked up fragments of local knowledge about Deadman's Hollow and the hermit who'd lived there. "Jasper Greyrock kept to himself," the woman at the grocery store told her. "Came to town maybe once a month for supplies, always paid cash, never said more than necessary. Polite enough, but you could tell he didn't want company." "Did he ever mention why he lived out there alone?" The woman shook her head. "That lake's got a bad reputation going back generations. Something about a mining accident in the old days. Folks just stay away from it now." Similar conversations yielded similar information. Uncle Jasper had been known but not welcomed, tolerated but not befriended. And Deadman's Hollow carried a weight of local superstition that no one wanted to explain in detail. Clara might have dismissed the local folklore entirely, if not for Elias's increasingly focused behavior around the lake. Her son had always been an imaginative child, but there was something different about the way he interacted with their new environment. He spent hours standing at the water's edge, completely still, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. "What are you doing out there?" she asked him one evening as they ate dinner on the back porch. "Just watching," Elias said. "The water's different in different places. Some parts are shallow and some parts are really deep. And there's things under there." "What kind of things?" "Old things, important things." He looked at her with the serious expression that meant he was working through something complicated in his 7-year-old mind. "I think the pirates really did hide treasure. Here, Mom, I can feel it." Clara wanted to discourage his treasure-hunting fantasies. She'd seen too many children disappointed by the gap between imagination and reality. But there was something in Elias's certainty that made her pause. Her son had always been intuitive about things other people missed. He'd known David was sick before the doctors found the cancer. He could predict thunderstorms hours before the weather service issued warnings. Maybe he was sensing something real about the lake. On their 10th day at Deadman's Hollow, Elias made his discovery. Clara was inside the cabin, trying to coax hot water from the temperamental plumbing system, when she heard Elias shouting from the lake. Not the excited shouting of a child at play, but urgent calls that made her drop everything and run. She found him waist-deep in the water near the north shore, struggling with something heavy. Mom, help me! I found it!" "Elias, get out of that water right now. You don't know how deep it gets." "But I found the treasure chest. It's real, Mom, just like I said." Clara waded into the lake, her shoes squelching in the muddy bottom, and saw what had captured Elias's attention. Half buried in the lake bed, covered in decades of sediment and algae, was a metal container roughly the size of a suitcase. It had handles on both sides, and what looked like a hinged lid secured with some kind of clasp mechanism. "Help me pull it out," Elias pleaded. "It's really heavy." Against her better judgment, Clara grabbed one handle while Elias took the other. The chest was indeed heavy, much heavier than its size suggested, and it took both of them working together to drag it through the shallow water to the shore. "Careful with it," Clara said as they set it down on dry land. "That metal looks pretty corroded. We don't want it to fall apart." Up close, the chest was even more intriguing. Despite decades underwater, it appeared to be in remarkably good condition. The metal was blackened and pitted, but structurally sound. More importantly, it was clearly very old. The craftsmanship spoke of a time when such things were built to last. "Can we open it?" Elias asked, bouncing with excitement. Clara examined the clasp mechanism. It was corroded, but not completely frozen. With some effort, she managed to work it loose. The lid opened with a grinding protest of old metal, revealing contents that made both of them gasp. The chest was lined with what appeared to be oiled canvas that had protected its contents from water damage. Inside, Clara found a collection of items that looked like they belonged in a museum. There were several leather-bound books, their pages slightly yellowed but still readable. Maps drawn on heavy paper, marked with symbols and notations in faded ink, and most remarkably, what appeared to be official documents bearing seals and signatures. "What is all this stuff?" Elias whispered, as if speaking too loudly might make the treasure disappear. Clara lifted out one of the books and opened it carefully. The pages were covered with handwritten entries in a neat, precise script, dates, names, numbers. It looked like some kind of record-keeping. The earliest entries were dated 1883. "It's old," she said, "really old." She picked up one of the maps and spread it carefully on the ground. It showed the lake and surrounding area, but with details that didn't match what they could see now. According to the map, there had once been buildings where now there was only forest, roads that no longer existed, and most intriguingly, the lake itself was shown as much smaller than it currently appeared. "Mom, look at this one." Elias had found a document that was different from the others, more official-looking, with elaborate seals and formal language. As Clara read it, her heart began to beat faster. It was some kind of transport manifest, listing quantities of gold coin and bullion that had been moved through the area in 1883. The total value listed made Clara dizzy. Even accounting for inflation and changes in gold prices, they were looking at a document that described treasure worth millions of dollars. "Elias," she said quietly, "I think you really did find something important." They spent the next hour examining the contents of the chest more carefully. The story that emerged was fragmentary but tantalizing. In 1883, during the aftermath of the Civil War, someone had used Deadman's Hollow as a temporary storage point for Confederate gold being moved north for sale. The operation had been secretive and apparently short-lived, but the records suggested substantial quantities of precious metals had passed through the area. More intriguingly, one of the final entries suggested that not all of the gold had successfully continued its journey north. There were references to emergency storage and temporary concealment that implied at least some of the treasure might still be hidden somewhere around the lake. As the sun set behind the mountains, Clara sat on the cabin's front porch, with the chest contents spread around her like pieces of a historical jigsaw puzzle. Elias had fallen asleep in the rocking chair beside her, exhausted by the excitement of his discovery. Looking out at the dark water of Deadman's Hollow, Clara felt her life shifting around her like the pieces of an earthquake settling into new positions. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a desperate widow counting coins on a kitchen table. Now she was the owner of property that might conceal a fortune in Civil War gold. The question was, what was she going to do about it? Clara spent the night reading through the documents from the chest by lamplight, afraid to leave them unattended, even for the hours she should have been sleeping. The story they told was more complex than she'd first realized, woven through with half-completed sentences and references to events she didn't understand. The man who'd kept these records, someone identified only as J. Morrison, transport coordinator, had been methodical in his documentation. Every movement of gold was noted, every transaction recorded with the precision of someone who understood the deadly consequences of losing track of valuable cargo during wartime. But the final entries, dated in late October 1883, told a different story. Morrison's handwriting became hurried, the entries shorter and more cryptic. References to federal attention and compromised routes suggested the operation had attracted unwanted notice. The last entry was dated October 31st, 1883, and consisted of a single line: "Emergency protocols activated. God help us all." When Elias woke the next morning, he found Clara still at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers and empty coffee cups. "Did you figure out where the treasure is?" he asked, climbing into her lap with the casual affection of a child who'd never doubted his mother could solve any puzzle. "I think we need to do some research first," Clara said, breathing in the scent of sleep-warm little boy hair. "These documents mention people and places we don't know about. Maybe we can find more information in town." Their first stop was the Fairmont Public Library, a brick building that looked like it had been built during the Depression and maintained with love, but limited funds ever since. Clara had hoped to find local historical records, but she hadn't. Expected to discover Martha Hendricks. Martha was the head librarian, a woman in her 70s with steel-grey hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. When Clara approached the reference desk with Elias in tow, Martha looked up from her cataloguing with the expression of someone delighted to have actual patrons on a Wednesday morning. "We're looking for information about local history," Clara said, "specifically about mining operations in Hancock County during the 1880s. Martha's expression shifted slightly, not unwelcoming, but suddenly more attentive. "That's quite specific. Are you working on some kind of research project? We inherited some property near here, Deadman's Hollow, and we found some old documents that reference mining activity from that period." Now, Martha was definitely paying attention. She glanced at Elias, who was exploring the children's section with the focused intensity he brought to all new environments, then back to Clara. "Deadman's Hollow," Martha said quietly. "That's the old Greyrock place. You knew my husband's uncle? Jasper Greyrock came in here maybe twice a year for 20 years. always looking for the same things: geological surveys, mining records, anything related to the Civil War period around the lake. Martha leaned forward slightly. "May I ask what kind of documents you found?" Clara hesitated. The rational part of her knew she should be cautious about revealing too much to strangers. But Martha had the kind of face that invited confidences, and Clara had been carrying the weight of Elias's discovery alone for too long. "Transport records from 1883. They mentioned gold being moved through the area." Martha nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she'd suspected. "Would you like to see what we have in our local history collection? Some of it might provide context for your documents." The local history section occupied a corner of the library's main floor, housed in filing cabinets and bound volumes that looked like they'd been compiled by generations of dedicated amateur historians. Martha pulled out several folders and spread them across a nearby table. The late 19th century was a complicated time in this part of West Virginia, Martha said. The Civil War had ended, but there were still plenty of people moving money and valuables around the country trying to rebuild their lives. Some of it was legitimate business, some of it wasn't. She opened one of the folders and showed Clara a hand-drawn map of the region as it had appeared in the 1880s. This area was much more populated then. There were mining camps, timber operations, small communities that disappeared when the resources played out. Clara compared the library's map to the one from the chest. The geography matched, but the level of human activity was dramatically different. Where now there was only forest, the 1880s map showed roads, buildings, active mining claims. What happened to all of these places? Economic collapse, mostly. When the easy coal played out and the timber was harvested, people moved on to better opportunities. Nature has a way of reclaiming abandoned places pretty quickly in these mountains. Martha pulled out another folder, this one containing newspaper clippings from the period. Clara read headlines about mine accidents, labor disputes, and occasional stories about mysterious strangers moving through the area with unknown purposes. There were always rumors about treasure hunters, Martha said. During the Civil War, a lot of wealthy families buried their valuables rather than risk losing them to occupying armies. After the war, fortune hunters came through regularly, following maps and stories that were usually worthless but occasionally led to something real. Elias appeared at Clara's elbow, having exhausted the children's section's possibilities. "Mom, look at this book I found." He was carrying a slim volume titled Ghost Stories and Local Legends of Hancock County. Clara started to redirect him toward something more age-appropriate, but Martha intervened. "That's actually quite relevant to what you're researching," she said. "Local folklore often preserves historical facts that didn't make it into official records." Clara opened the book and found a chapter devoted to Deadman's Hollow. The account was written in the breathless style of local ghost stories, but the basic facts aligned with what she'd learned from the transport records. According to the legend, a group of men had attempted to hide Confederate gold at the lake in 1883. Federal agents had tracked them to the area, leading to a confrontation that left several men dead and the gold's location lost. Local residents had avoided the lake ever since, believing it to be cursed by the violence that had occurred there. "How much of this is true?" Clara asked. Martha smiled. "Probably more than you'd expect. These stories get embellished over time, but they usually start with real events. And I can tell you that Jasper Greyrock believed there was something to find out there. He spent decades researching the same period you're asking about." As they prepared to leave the library, Martha walked them to the door with a thoughtful expression. "Mrs. Myles," she said quietly, "if you do find anything significant, please be careful who you tell about it. There are people around here who've been looking for that gold a lot longer than you have. Not all of them have good intentions." Driving home, Clara found herself checking the rearview mirror more often than usual. Martha's warning had been gently delivered, but there was something in the older woman's tone that suggested she knew more than she'd shared. That evening, as Clara tucked Elias into bed, He looked up at her with serious eyes. "Mom, I had another. You dream about the lake." "What kind of dream?" "There were men with shovels digging holes by the water, and they were scared. Really, really scared." Elias pulled his blanket up to his chin. "I think they buried something and then couldn't find it again." Clara kissed his forehead, but Martha's words echoed in her mind as she turned off the lights. Some secrets, it seemed, had been waiting a very long time to be discovered. The discovery came 3 days later, purely by accident. Clara had been sweeping the cabin's front porch when one of the floorboards gave way beneath her broom, revealing a gap that shouldn't have existed. When she pried up the damaged board to assess the repair needed, she found something that made her heart race. Hidden in the space between the floor joists was a wrapped package, carefully sealed in oiled cloth and tucked away from moisture and curious eyes. Inside the cloth was a leather journal, its cover worn smooth by years of handling. The first page contained an inscription in handwriting she was beginning to recognize: "Property of Jasper Greyrock. Private Thoughts and Observations, 1985-2024. Clara settled into Uncle Jasper's rocking chair and began to read. The journal revealed a man obsessed. For nearly 40 years, Jasper had been systematically searching for the gold that Morrison's transport record suggested was still hidden somewhere around Deadman's Hollow. His entries documented decades of careful exploration, failed excavations, and growing certainty that he was close to solving a puzzle that had frustrated him since his youth. March 15th, 1995. Spent 6 hours with the metal detector along the North Shore. Strong readings 15 feet out from the big oak, but the water's too deep for me to investigate properly. Need to find a way to work underwater. September 3rd, 2001. The Morrison documents make more sense now. The emergency protocols he mentions weren't about hiding the gold from the Federals. They were about hiding it from Morrison's own men. Someone was planning to steal the shipment. June 12, 2010, Martha Hendricks brought me more newspaper clippings from 1883. 3 bodies were found in the woods 5 miles north of here in November of that year. All shot, no identification, but the timing matches Morrison's final entries perfectly. As Clara read deeper into the journal, a disturbing pattern emerged. Jasper hadn't been the only person searching for the lost gold. Over the years, others had come to Deadman's Hollow following the same historical trail, asking the same questions, looking for the same buried treasure. July 20th, 2018. The Cromwell. Boy came around again today, more aggressive this time, demanding I share what I know about his family's rightful property. Told him same thing I've told his father and grandfather. If the gold belongs to anybody, it belongs to whoever finds it first. But I'm starting to think these visits aren't random. They know something I don't. November 5th, 2020. Found tire tracks. Near the South Trail this morning. Someone's been watching the place. Need to be more careful about when I do my searching. Starting to think maybe I should have told someone about what I've found just in case. The final entries were recent, dated just months before Uncle Jasper's death. His handwriting had become shakier, but his determination hadn't wavered. January 8, 2024. The underwater metal detector readings are getting stronger. Whatever's down there is big, and it's definitely metal. Problem is, it's in about 12 feet of water and I'm too old to be diving. Maybe it's time to bring in help. February 14th, 2024. Tried to call that diving service in Morgantown, but hung up before they answered. How do you explain what you're looking for without sounding like a crazy old man? And what happens when word gets out that there's actually something worth finding here? March 3rd, 2024. Someone broke into the cabin while I was in town. Nothing obvious taken, but things were moved around. They were looking for something specific, the Morrison documents probably. Good thing I keep them in the lake chest. Clara's blood went cold as she read the final entry. March 15th, 2024. Marcus Cromwell came by today with 2 men I didn't recognize. Not a friendly visit. They made it clear they think the gold belongs to them by right of inheritance. Cromwell claims his great-great-grandfather was Morrison's business partner, says he has documents proving it. Gave me 2 weeks to come to a reasonable arrangement, or they'll take steps to protect their interests. Starting to think this inheritance I plan to leave to David's family might be more dangerous than valuable. Maybe I should destroy everything and let the secret die with me. The journal ended there. According to the lawyer's timeline, Uncle Jasper had died in a car accident just 3 days after writing that final entry. Clara sat in the gathering dusk, trying to process what she'd learned. Uncle Jasper hadn't died because of bad weather or old age. He'd died because someone wanted what he'd spent 40 years trying to find, the same something that was now legally hers. Mom. She looked up to find Elias standing in the cabin doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. I had another dream, he said, about the man who used to live here. Clara patted her lap, and Elias climbed up into the rocking chair with her. What kind of dream? He was scared, really scared. There were bad men coming to take something that didn't belong to them. Elias looked out at the dark water of the lake. He hid things so they wouldn't find them, but he wanted someone good to find them later. Clara hugged her son closer, feeling the weight of secrets that seemed to grow heavier with each revelation. Elias, tomorrow we're going to start being more careful about who we talk to and what we tell people. Okay? Because of the treasure? Because some treasures come with dangers. That night, Clara lay awake listening to the sounds of the forest around them. Every snapping branch, every rustle of leaves made her tense with the possibility that Marcus Cromwell and his associates might be out there in the darkness, watching and waiting. Around midnight, she heard the distinctive sound of a car engine, idling somewhere along the dirt road that led to their property. The sound lasted maybe 10 minutes before fading away, but it was enough to convince Clara that Uncle Jasper's fears had been well-founded. They were no longer alone at Deadman's Hollow. The next morning, Clara made 2 decisions that would shape everything that followed. First, she moved the Morrison documents from the chest to a new hiding place inside the cabin, where they'd be safer from both moisture and uninvited visitors. Second, she drove to town and bought the biggest, most reliable lock she could find for the cabin's front door. At the hardware store, the elderly clerk looked at her purchase with interest. "Planning to lock up something valuable?" he asked conversationally. Clara met his gaze steadily. "Planning to keep out something dangerous." The clerk nodded as if this made perfect sense. "You're the new owner of the Grey Rock place, aren't you? Word gets around fast in a small town." "Word about what?" "About folks asking questions. Someone was in here yesterday wanting to know if you'd bought any mining equipment lately. Metal detectors, diving gear, that sort of thing." The clerk handed her the lock and her change. "Told them it wasn't any of my business what my customers buy, but you might want to know that people are taking an interest." Driving home, Clara checked her rearview mirror constantly and took a longer route that would make it harder for anyone to follow her directly to the lake. But as she turned onto the dirt road that led to Deadman's Hollow, she saw fresh tire tracks in the mud, tracks that definitely hadn't been there that morning. Someone had been at their home while they were away. Clara's hands shook as she unlocked the cabin door, grateful now for the sturdy lock she'd installed. Inside, everything appeared normal at first glance, but she'd lived in the space long enough to notice subtle differences. The kitchen chair wasn't quite pushed under the table the way she'd left it. One of the books on Uncle Jasper's shelf was turned backward. Someone had been inside, searching carefully but not carefully enough. "Stay close to me," she whispered to Elias as they moved through the cabin room by room. The Morrison documents were still safe in their new hiding place behind the loose stone in the fireplace, but Clara knew their security was an illusion. If someone was determined enough to break in once, they'd do it again. That evening she made a decision that surprised herself. Instead of running, which every maternal instinct screamed at her to do, she decided to fight back with information. If people were willing to commit crimes to find Uncle Jasper's treasure, Then the treasure was real and substantial, and if it was real, she owed it to Elias to claim what was rightfully theirs, but she needed help. Her first night searches of the lake were clumsy affairs conducted by flashlight, while Elias slept inside the locked cabin. Clara had never been comfortable in deep water, but desperation gave her courage she didn't know she possessed. Using Uncle Jasper's notes as a guide, she waded into the dark water with a long stick, probing the lake bottom for the metal objects his detector had identified. The water was shockingly cold even in late spring, and the muddy bottom sucked at her boots with every step. More than once she lost her footing and nearly fell into water over her head. But on her third night of searching, her stick struck something that rang with the distinctive sound of metal against metal. The object was too large and too deeply buried for her to excavate alone, but its location matched perfectly with Uncle Jasper's most recent notes. Whatever was down there, it was exactly where he'd expected to find it. "Mom, what are you doing?" Clara spun around to find Elias standing at the water's edge in his pajamas, looking at her with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "You should be asleep, baby. I heard you moving around outside. Are you looking for the treasure without me?" Clara waded back to shore, dripping and shivering. "I was just checking something. It's dangerous to do this in the dark. But you found something, didn't you? I can tell by your face." Elias had always been able to read her emotions with uncanny accuracy. Clara wrapped him in the towel she'd brought and pulled him close. "Maybe, but we need help to find out for sure." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Clara was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard footsteps on the front porch. Through the window, she saw a man in his 60s examining the documents she'd left scattered on the kitchen table. Documents that contained just enough real information to be intriguing, but not enough to reveal their most important secrets. "Can I help you?" Clara asked, stepping through the front door with what she hoped was confident authority. The man straightened with the easy movement of someone accustomed to being caught in places he wasn't supposed to be. He was tall and lean, with graying hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His clothes suggested someone who spent time outdoors but wasn't afraid of getting dirty. "Mrs. Myles, I'm Ray Dalton. I teach local history at the community college in Fairmont." He gestured toward the papers on the table. "Martha Hendricks mentioned you'd found some interesting documents related to Civil War-era activity in this area." Clara studied his face, trying to gauge whether he represented help or another threat. "What kind of interest do you have in Civil War history, Professor Dalton?" "The academic kind, mostly. But I'll admit, I've always been curious about the stories surrounding this particular location." Ray glanced around the cabin with obvious familiarity. "I knew Jasper Greyrock fairly well. We shared an interest in local historical mysteries." "How?" "Well," Ray's expression became more serious. "Well enough that he called me 2 weeks before he died. He said he'd found something important and wanted a historian's opinion about how to handle it properly. We were supposed to meet the day after his accident." Clara felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to align. "What did he tell you about what he'd found?" "Nothing specific over the phone, but Jasper had been researching the same historical period for decades. And based on what I can see here," Ray gestured toward the papers, "I think he finally found what he was looking for." Elias appeared from the back bedroom, where Clara had told him to stay while she dealt with their visitor. He walked directly to Ray with the fearless curiosity that made Clara's heart race with protective anxiety. "Are you here about the treasure?" Elias asked. Ray knelt down to Elias's eye level. "What treasure is that?" "The gold that's buried under the lake. Mom and I found the maps that show where it is." Clara started to intervene, but Ray held up a gentle hand. "That's very exciting. Have you found any of the gold yet?" "Not yet. But Mom's been looking at night when she thinks I'm asleep." Elias glanced at Clara with a grin that was part apology, part conspiracy. "I think she found something big." Ray stood and looked at Clara with new respect. "Mrs. Myles, I think we need to have a serious conversation about what you've discovered. and what it might mean for your safety. Over the next hour, Ray revealed the depth of his knowledge about the historical events surrounding Deadman's Hollow. He confirmed most of what Clara had pieced together from Uncle Jasper's research, and added crucial details that put the mystery in clearer focus. The Morrison transport operation was more sophisticated than most people realize, Ray explained. They weren't just moving random Confederate gold north for sale. They were liquidating the treasury reserves of several prominent Southern families who were trying to rebuild after the war. How much money are we talking about? In 1883 dollars? Probably around 50,000. In today's purchasing power, you're looking at something close to $2 million. Ray pulled out a folder he'd brought with him, but that's assuming the transport manifests were accurate and the gold actually made it to this location. The folder contained photocopies of newspaper articles, court records, and other official documents that Ray had collected over years of research. The picture they painted was of a criminal enterprise that had attracted attention from federal authorities and competing treasure hunters alike. The Cromwell family has legitimate historical claims to at least part of whatever Morrison was transporting, Ray said. Marcus Cromwell's great-great-grandfather was Morrison's business partner in several ventures, but their claim is complicated by the fact that Morrison apparently tried to cut the Cromwells out of the final operation. So they're not just random treasure hunters? No, they've been searching for this gold for 4 generations. And they're not the only ones with historical ties to the story. Ray's expression grew darker. Mrs. Myles, Jasper's death wasn't an accident. I can't prove it, but I'm certain of it. Someone killed him to prevent him from recovering that treasure. Clara felt the familiar chill of fear, but it was tempered now by something stronger. Professor Dalton, if we found the gold, how would we go about claiming it legally? Very carefully, Ray said, and with lots of documentation. Treasure hunting law is complicated, especially when there are competing historical claims. But if you can prove the gold was abandoned property on land you legally own, you'd have a strong case. Elias had been listening to their conversation, with the intense concentration he brought to subjects that captured his imagination. Now he looked up at Ray with serious eyes. Would you help us find it? Mom needs someone who knows about the old stuff, and I think the lake wants us to find. What's hidden there? Ray glanced at Clara, then back at Elias. What makes you think the lake wants you to find anything? It talks to me, Elias said simply, not with words. But I can feel where the important things are buried. Clara expected Ray to dismiss Elias's claim with adult skepticism. Instead, the professor nodded thoughtfully. Some people are sensitive to things others can't perceive, he said. If you really can sense where things are hidden, that would make our search much more efficient. That evening, after Ray had left with promises to return the next day with more specialized equipment, Clara sat on the porch, watching Elias skip stones across the dark water of Deadman's Hollow. For the first time since inheriting Uncle Jasper's burden, she felt like they had a real chance of success, but she also understood with crystal clarity that they were running out of time. Marcus Cromwell and his associates wouldn't wait much longer before taking more direct action. The treasure hunt was about to become a race. Ray returned the next morning carrying equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. The underwater metal detector was sleek and modern, a far cry from the simple handheld device Uncle Jasper had used for his searches. More importantly, Ray brought diving gear that would allow them to investigate the lake bed properly. Where did you get all this? Clara asked, as Ray unpacked his equipment on the cabin's front porch. The college has an archaeology program. Technically, this is research into local historical sites. Ray's smile was slightly sheepish. I may have bent the truth a little about our specific objectives, but everything we're doing is academically legitimate. While Ray set up the metal detector, Clara discovered another of Uncle Jasper's secrets. Hidden behind a false back in the bedroom closet was a collection of equipment that revealed the true scope of his treasure hunting efforts. There were underwater cameras, diving masks, waterproof containers, and most surprisingly, a complete set of breathing apparatus that looked like it had been maintained with military precision. "Your uncle was more prepared than I realized," Ray said when Clara showed him what she'd found. "This is professional-grade diving equipment. He must have been planning a major underwater operation." Elias examined the diving gear with the fascination of a child who'd never seen anything more exciting. "Can I try it on?" "Absolutely not," Clara said immediately. "This is dangerous equipment for experienced adults only." But as Ray began his systematic survey of the lake with the metal detector, it became clear that Elias's input would be crucial to their success. The boy seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of the lake's geography that neither Clara nor Ray could match. "Try over there," Elias said, pointing to a section of water that looked identical to everywhere else they'd searched. "There's something big under the mud in that spot." Ray moved the detector to the indicated area and immediately got strong readings. "How did you know that?" Elias shrugged. "It feels different, like there's something important waiting." Over the course of the morning, Elias directed Ray to 3 locations where the metal detector registered significant buried objects. Each site was in water between 8 and 12 feet deep, too deep for casual investigation, but accessible to someone with proper diving equipment. "We're going to need to go down there," Ray said as they took a break for lunch. "The detector can tell us something's there, but we need visual confirmation before we start any major recovery operation." Clara looked at the dark water with familiar dread. She'd never been a strong swimmer, and the thought of diving into the murky depths of Deadman's Hollow filled her with anxiety that bordered on panic. "I can't do it," she said quietly. "I'm sorry, but I just can't go down there." "I can," Ray said. "I've been diving for 20 years. It's not that dangerous if you know what you're doing." They spent the afternoon preparing for Ray's descent. Clara studied the underwater cameras while Ray checked and rechecked his breathing equipment. Elias helped by pointing out additional areas of interest that he thought might be worth investigating. "Remember," Clara said as Ray prepared to enter, "the water. We're just looking today. Don't try to move anything heavy by yourself." Ray nodded and slipped beneath the surface with the controlled grace of an experienced diver. Through the underwater camera's display, Clara and Elias watched as he descended toward the lake bed, following the metal detector's guidance toward their first target. What Ray found exceeded their most optimistic expectations. Buried in the lake bed, partially covered by decades of accumulated sediment, was a collection of metal containers that matched exactly the descriptions in Morrison's transport manifests. There were strong boxes, sealed barrels, and what appeared to be a large safe that had been deliberately weighted down and submerged. "There's got to be 20 separate containers down here," Ray's voice crackled through the surface communication system. "Some of them are small enough to bring up by hand, but that safe is going to require serious equipment." As Ray documented each find with the underwater camera, Clara felt a mixture of excitement and growing apprehension. They'd found the treasure, there was no doubt about that now. But the sheer quantity of hidden wealth raised questions about how they were going to recover it safely and legally. Their planning session was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching on the dirt road. Clara looked up to see 2 pickup trucks bouncing toward the cabin, carrying more passengers than any friendly visit would require. "Ray, get out of the water," Clara called into the communication system. "We have company." The trucks stopped in front of the cabin, and 6 men climbed out with the coordinated efficiency of people who'd worked together before. The man leading the group was tall and imposing, with graying hair, and the kind of confident bearing that suggested he was accustomed to getting his way. "Mrs. Myles, I'm Marcus Cromwell. I believe we need to have a conversation." Clara stepped protectively in front of Elias, while mentally cataloguing the equipment scattered around their makeshift work area. There was no way to hide what they'd been doing. The metal detector, diving gear, and underwater cameras made their activities obvious. "Mr. Cromwell, I was wondering when you'd introduce yourself." Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I apologize for not visiting sooner. I wanted to give you time to settle in and discover the reality of your situation. He gestured toward the lake. I see you've been making progress. I don't know what you mean. Mrs. Myles, my family has been researching this site for over a century. We know exactly what's down there, and we know you found it. Marcus's tone remained conversational, but his companions had positioned themselves to block any escape routes. The question is whether we can reach a mutually beneficial arrangement. Ray surfaced at the edge of the lake, immediately recognizing the tension in the situation. He swam toward shore with deliberate calm, not wanting to provoke a confrontation while Clara and Elias were exposed. Professor Dalton, Marcus nodded in acknowledgement. I should have expected you'd become involved eventually. Your reputation for historical research is well known in certain circles. Marcus, Ray replied, climbing out of the water with careful dignity. I was wondering when you'd resort to intimidation tactics. This isn't intimidation, Ray. This is a business proposition. Marcus pulled out a folder and handed it to Clara. These documents establish my family's legal claim to any precious metals recovered from this site. Morrison was transporting gold that belonged to my great-great-grandfather's mining consortium. Clara opened the folder and found herself looking at what appeared to be legitimate 19th-century contracts and partnership agreements. The papers were old, properly preserved, and bore official seals that looked authentic. Even if these documents are real, Clara said, this is my property. Now, whatever's buried here belongs to me. That's where you're wrong, Marcus said. Mineral rights and surface rights are different things, and in this case the mineral rights, including any precious metals deposited on the property, belong to the Cromwell Mining Trust. Elias had been listening to the conversation with the serious attention he gave to all adult conflicts that affected their family. Now he stepped forward with the fearless directness that sometimes made Clara's heart stop. You're lying, he said to Marcus. Uncle Jasper's ghost told me the bad men would come and try to steal what doesn't belong to them. Marcus stared at Elias with surprise that quickly shifted to something more calculating. What exactly did Uncle Jasper's ghost tell you, son? Clara started to intervene, but Elias was already answering with the honesty that made him vulnerable and powerful in equal measure. He said the gold belongs to whoever finds it first, and he said the bad men killed him because he wouldn't tell them where it was hidden. Elias looked directly at Marcus with 7-year-old fearlessness. He said, "You're the bad man." The silence that followed was broken by the distinctive sound of Martha Hendricks's car coming up the dirt road. Clara had never been so grateful to see the elderly librarian, who climbed out of her vehicle with the determined air of someone arriving to settle a dispute. "Marcus Cromwell," Martha said without preamble, "you and your boys need to get off this property before I call the sheriff." Marcus's confident demeanor flickered for the first time. "Martha, this is a private business matter. This is harassment, and we both know it." Martha walked directly to Clara's side with the protective instincts of a grandmother defending her family. "Mrs. Myles, I brought you something I think you need to see." She handed Clara an envelope that felt heavy with official papers. "Jasper gave me this 2 weeks before he died. He said if anything happened to him, I should make sure his heir got these documents." Clara opened the envelope and found herself holding what appeared to be a will and several legal documents that had been notarized and witnessed. According to the papers, Uncle Jasper had specifically bequeathed all mineral rights associated with his property to his heir, along with any archaeological or historical discoveries made on the land. "It seems," Martha said with satisfaction, "that Jasper anticipated your family's interest in his property, Marcus, and he took steps to ensure his wishes would be legally protected." Marcus's expression had turned cold, but he gestured to his companions, and they began moving back toward their trucks. "This isn't over, Mrs. Myles. My family's rights go back a lot further than Jasper Greyrock's will." As the trucks disappeared down the dirt road, Clara felt the weight of escalation settling around them like storm clouds. They'd found the treasure, established their legal right to claim it, and made enemies who weren't going to give up easily. The race was about to become a war. The revelation came from an unexpected source 3 days later. Clara was in town buying supplies when she noticed the black sedan that had been following her since she left the hardware store. Instead of driving directly home, she took a circuitous route through Fairmont's residential neighborhoods, confirming her suspicions when the sedan maintained its distance through several unnecessary turns, rather than leading potential threats. Back to Elias and Ray, Clara parked at the police station and waited. The sedan drove past without stopping, but not before she got a clear look at the driver, one of Marcus Cromwell's associates from their unpleasant visit. Inside the police station, Clara found herself face to face with Sheriff Tom Bradley, a man in his 50s with the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent decades dealing with mountain people and their complicated family disputes. "Mrs. Myles," he said after she'd explained the situation, "I'm familiar with the Cromwell family and their various business interests. They've been involved in legal disputes over mining claims for as long as I've been wearing this badge." "Are they dangerous?" Sheriff Bradley chose his words carefully. "They're persistent, and they have resources that most people around here don't. But they've always stayed on the legal side of their disagreements." He paused. "Mostly. What does mostly mean?" "It means there have been incidents over the years involving people who got in the way of their treasure hunting activities. Nothing I could ever prove, but enough to make me pay attention when their name comes up." Clara left the police station with Sheriff Bradley's business card and a promise that he'd increase patrols around Deadman's Hollow. But she also left with the uncomfortable knowledge that local law enforcement was limited in what they could do about Marcus Cromwell's intimidation tactics. She was driving home when her cell phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Myles, this is Marcus Cromwell. I think we got off on the wrong foot yesterday." Clara pulled over to the side of the road, her heart racing. "How did you get this number?" "Small town, Mrs. Myles. People talk." Marcus's voice was calm, reasonable. "I'd like to propose a meeting. Just you and me, no lawyers or associates. I think we can reach an understanding that benefits everyone. I'm not interested in any deals. You should be, because I have information you need to know before you continue your treasure hunting activities. Information about the real ownership of that gold." Against her better judgment, Clara found herself listening. "The Morrison transport operation wasn't what you think it was," Marcus continued, "and neither was my family's involvement. Meet me at the Fairmont Diner in an hour, and I'll show you documents that will change how you think about this entire situation." Clara sat in her parked car for 10 minutes after the call ended, weighing her options. Every instinct told her not to trust Marcus Cromwell. But if he had information that could affect their legal claim to the treasure, she needed to know what it was. The Fairmont Diner was busy with the early dinner crowd when Clara arrived. She found Marcus sitting in a corner booth, dressed in casual clothes that made him look more like a college professor than a potential threat. A manila folder sat on the table between them. "Thank you for coming," Marcus said as Clara slid into the opposite side of the booth. "I know this situation has been stressful for you. Get to the point, Mr. Cromwell." Marcus opened the folder and spread out several documents that looked genuinely old and official. "These are the original partnership agreements between Morrison and my great-great-grandfather, Samuel Cromwell. As you can see, they established the Cromwell Mining Trust as equal partners in all transport and storage operations." Clara examined the papers. Unlike the documents she'd seen before, these had the detailed complexity of legitimate business contracts. They specified profit-sharing arrangements, territorial responsibilities, and most importantly, joint ownership of any precious metals held in temporary storage. "This still doesn't give you rights to property I legally inherited." "Actually, it does." Marcus pulled out another document, this one more recent, bearing county seals and legal stamps. Mineral rights in this county are governed by 19th century mining law. When Morrison and my ancestor established their partnership, they filed claims that supersede any subsequent property transfers. Clara felt her confidence wavering as she studied the legal filing. It appeared to establish the Cromwell Mining Trust as the legal owner of any precious metals discovered on a large tract of land that included Deadman's Hollow. Why are you showing me this? Because I don't want a legal battle that could take years to resolve and cost both of us a fortune in attorney fees. I'm prepared to offer you a partnership arrangement. Marcus leaned forward with what appeared to be genuine sincerity. 50-50 split of whatever we recover. You provide access to the property, I provide the legal protection and resources needed for a major recovery operation. Clara studied Marcus's face, looking for signs of deception. What happened to Uncle Jasper? Marcus's expression became more serious. Jasper was a stubborn old man who refused to listen to reason. He thought he could keep the location of the gold secret and recover it himself. That was never realistic. Did you kill him? Mrs. Myles, I'm a businessman, not a murderer. Jasper died in a car accident because he was driving too fast on dangerous mountain roads in bad weather. Marcus gathered up his documents. But his death was a tragedy that could have been avoided if he'd been willing to work with us instead of against us. Clara left the diner with more questions than answers and a business card with Marcus's direct phone number. The partnership offer was tempting. 50% of $2 million was still life-changing money, and it would eliminate the legal uncertainties that made her treasure-hunting activities risky. But when she arrived back at Deadman's Hollow, she found Ray and Elias in animated conversation about their latest underwater discoveries. "Mom!" Elias ran to greet her with the excitement of a child who'd been holding back important news. Ray found the really big box, the one I told him was the most important. Ray emerged from the cabin with photos from his latest dive. "Clara, you need to see this. We found Morrison's primary cache, and it's exactly where Elias said it would be." The underwater photographs showed a large metal strongbox partially buried in the lake bed. Unlike the smaller containers they'd found earlier, this one bore official markings that were still visible despite decades underwater. "Can you read what it says?" Clara asked. Ray pointed to lettering stamped into the metal. "Confederate States Treasury, Richmond Reserve, 1863. Clara stared at the photographs. "This isn't private gold being transported for sale. This is actual Confederate government treasure." "Which changes everything," Ray said. "Government treasure has different legal status than private property. And if this box contains what I think it does, we're looking at a discovery of significant historical importance." Clara told Ray about her meeting with Marcus Cromwell and the documents he'd shown her. Ray listened with growing concern, particularly when she described the mining claims that seemed to establish Cromwell ownership of mineral rights. "Clara, I need to tell you something I should have mentioned earlier." Ray sat down heavily in Uncle Jasper's rocking chair. "I wasn't entirely honest about my relationship with your uncle." Clara felt a familiar chill of apprehension. "What do you mean?" "Jasper and I weren't just academic colleagues. We were partners. He provided access to the property and historical research. I provided diving expertise and historical authentication. We agreed to split whatever we found 50-50. The betrayal hit Clara like a physical blow. "You've been lying to me this entire time." "Not lying, just not telling you the whole truth." Ray's expression was genuinely remorseful. "But Jasper's death changed everything. When he died, our partnership died with him. I had no legal claim to anything he'd discovered. So you decided to manipulate his heir instead. I decided to honor my friend's memory by helping his family claim what was rightfully theirs." Ray leaned forward. "Clara, Jasper specifically, told me that if anything happened to him, I should make sure his inheritance went to people who would use it responsibly. He was terrified that the Cromwells would eventually find the treasure and use it for purposes he couldn't support." "What purposes?" Ray hesitated, then pulled out his own folder of documents. The Cromwell family isn't just interested in the gold for its monetary value. They're part of a larger organization that's been collecting Confederate artifacts and treasure for decades. Their ultimate goal is to fund a museum and cultural center dedicated to what they call Southern heritage preservation. Clara looked at the documents Ray handed her. Photographs of Marcus Cromwell at various events, newspaper clippings about controversial monuments and historical displays, financial records showing connections to organizations that promoted revisionist Civil War history. They want to use Confederate gold to fund Confederate propaganda, she said. That's exactly what Jasper was afraid of. He spent 40 years searching for that treasure, because he believed it belonged in a legitimate museum where it could be studied and displayed in proper historical context. As Clara absorbed these revelations, Elias appeared on the porch with his serious expression that meant he'd been thinking about adult problems. "Mom, the lake is telling me we need to get the treasure out soon. Something bad is coming." Clara looked at her son, then at Ray, then at the photographs of Confederate gold sitting 12 feet below the surface of Deadman's Hollow. "Ray, how long would it take to recover the main strongbox?" "With proper equipment, maybe 6 hours of careful work." Clara made a decision that surprised herself. "Then we're going to do it tomorrow night, before Marcus Cromwell decides that business partnerships aren't worth the trouble." As the sun set behind the mountains, Clara sat on the porch watching Elias skip stones across the dark water. Tomorrow they would either secure their future or lose everything in the attempt. But for the first time since inheriting Uncle Jasper's burden, she felt like they were fighting for something more important than money. They were fighting for the right to determine how history would be remembered. Clara spent the night studying Uncle Jasper's diving equipment with the methodical attention of someone whose life might depend on understanding every detail. The gear was older than what Ray used, but it had been maintained with meticulous care. More importantly, it was designed for the specific conditions of Deadman's Hollow, the cold water, limited visibility, and challenging bottom terrain that had claimed so many previous treasure hunting attempts. "Are you sure about this?" Ray asked as Clara practiced with the breathing apparatus in the shallow water near shore. "I can handle the recovery operation myself. 2 divers working together will be faster and safer than one working alone," Clara replied, though her voice shook slightly as she adjusted the mask. "And if something goes wrong down there, Elias needs both of us to come back up." The truth was more complicated than Clara was willing to admit. After learning about Ray's original partnership with Uncle Jasper, she didn't trust anyone else to have exclusive access to the treasure. If she was going to risk everything on one desperate recovery attempt, she needed to be personally involved in every aspect of the operation. Elias had appointed himself as mission coordinator, a role he approached with the serious dedication of a child who understood the importance of what they were attempting. He'd spent the morning creating detailed maps of the lake bottom based on his intuitive understanding of where things were hidden. "The big box is here," he said, pointing to a spot on his hand-drawn chart. "But there are smaller things buried around it that you should get too, like they were all hidden at the same time." Ray compared Elias's map to his own underwater survey notes and found them remarkably accurate. "How do you know where things are without going down there yourself?" Elias shrugged with the casual acceptance of a child who'd never doubted his own perceptions. "The lake shows me. It wants the old things to come up into the light again." Their planning was interrupted by a phone call from Martha Hendricks. Her voice was tense with worry when Clara answered. "Clara, you need to know that Marcus Cromwell was at the library this morning with 2 men I didn't recognize. They were looking through county records and asking questions about diving permits and underwater salvage regulations." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggested they're planning their own recovery operation very soon. And Clara, one of the men had a gun. I could see it under his jacket when he reached for a book." Clara felt her stomach clench with familiar fear. Did they say anything about timing? They were asking about county regulations for weekend excavation. Permits? I think they're planning to move tomorrow night. After Martha hung up, Clara shared the information with Ray and watched his expression grow grave. If they're bringing armed men to a treasure recovery operation, they're not planning to honor any legal agreements, Ray said. We need to move tonight, or we're going to lose our chance entirely. Clara looked at Elias, who was listening to their conversation with the intense attention he brought to all adult crises that affected their family. Baby, I need you to understand something. What we're going to do tonight is dangerous. If something goes wrong, nothing's going to go wrong, Elias said with the confident certainty of childhood. The lake wants us to find the treasure. It's been waiting for the right people to come along. As the sun set behind the mountains, Clara and Ray made their final preparations. They checked and rechecked their diving equipment, tested their underwater communication system, and reviewed their plan for bringing the heavy strongbox to the surface using inflatable lifting bags that Ray had borrowed from the college's archaeology department. The most dangerous part will be the initial excavation, Ray explained as they suited up in their diving gear. That strongbox has been buried for over a century. The sediment around it is going to be packed hard, and we'll have limited visibility while we're digging. Clara nodded, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. The thought of working in the dark water 12 feet below the surface made her heart race with anxiety that bordered on panic. But the alternative, letting Marcus Cromwell and his armed associates claim the treasure, was worse than her fear. Mum, Elias appeared at her side as she pulled on her diving mask. Uncle Jasper wants me to tell you something. Clara knelt down to Elias's eye level. What does he want you to tell me? He says to look for the metal box with his initials on. JG, it's got something inside that will help you prove the treasure belongs to us. Elias's expression was completely serious, and he says to be careful of the bad men who might come tonight. Clara hugged her son close, breathing in the familiar scent of little boy hair and childhood innocence. I love you, baby, no matter what happens tonight. Remember that everything I'm doing is to give you a better life. I know, Mom, and the lake knows too. Ray had positioned himself at the water's edge with the underwater lights and lifting equipment. The plan was straightforward. Descend to the main cache site, excavate the Confederate strongbox and any smaller containers they could locate, attach the lifting bags, and bring everything to the surface before Marcus Cromwell's people arrived. Communication. Check, Ray said into his headset as Clara waded into the cold water. I can hear you clearly, Clara replied, though her voice was tight with nervousness. The descent into the dark water was every bit as terrifying as Clara had expected. Below 6 feet, the lake became a world of absolute blackness, penetrated only by their diving lights. The bottom was thick with sediment that clouded the water with every movement, and the cold seemed to seep through her wetsuit and into her bones. But as they reached the cache site, Clara felt her fear giving way to focused determination. The Confederate strongbox was exactly where Elias had said it would be, partially buried but clearly visible in the beam of her diving light, and scattered around it were smaller containers that matched the descriptions in Morrison's transport. Manifests. Starting excavation of the main target, Ray's voice crackled through the underwater communication system. Working together, they began the careful process of digging the strongbox free from decades of accumulated sediment. The work was slow and physically demanding, made more difficult by the limited visibility and the need to avoid damaging whatever was inside the sealed container. 20 minutes into the excavation, Clara's light illuminated something that made her heart race. Partially buried near the strongbox was a smaller metal container bearing the initials JG, exactly what Elias had told her to look for. Ray, I found something. She worked the smaller box free and opened it carefully. Inside, protected by oiled cloth, just like the original Morrison documents, was a collection of papers that appeared to be Uncle Jasper's final research notes. But these weren't the historical documents she'd expected. They were legal documents, recent legal documents. By the light of her underwater lamp, Clara read a notarized statement that made everything clear. Uncle Jasper had spent the final months of his life working with lawyers to establish an irrevocable trust that would protect any treasure discovered on his property from competing historical claims. The trust specifically excluded any organization or individual who intended to use Confederate artifacts for the promotion of divisive historical narratives or political purposes. Marcus Cromwell and his Southern Heritage Foundation were legally excluded from any claim to the treasure. "Clara, we've got the strongbox free," Ray's voice interrupted her reading. "But we need to move fast. I'm seeing lights on the shore." Clara looked up toward the surface and saw what Ray had spotted, flashlight beams moving through the trees around the cabin. Marcus Cromwell's people had arrived earlier than expected. "How many?" Clara asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "At least 4, maybe more. And they're setting up some kind of equipment near the water." Clara sealed Uncle Jasper's legal documents back in their container and attached it to her diving belt. Then she helped Ray position the lifting bags around the Confederate strongbox. The inflatable bags would bring the heavy container to the surface, but the process would take several minutes and create obvious disturbance in the water. "On my count," Ray said. 3, 2, 1. They activated the lifting system simultaneously. The bags inflated with compressed air, and the strongbox began its slow ascent toward the surface. But the disturbance also created a cloud of sediment that made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. "Clara, there are men with lights at the water's edge." Elias's voice came through their communication system from his position in the cabin. "And they have guns." Clara's blood went cold. Their plan had assumed they would have time to bring the treasure to shore and secure it before anyone arrived to challenge their claim. Instead, they were trapped underwater, while armed men controlled the shoreline. "Ray, we need to surface away from the main landing area," Clara said. "Can we come up on the far side of the lake? The equipment isn't designed for that kind of distance, and we'd be leaving the strongbox for them to claim." As if to punctuate Ray's concern, they heard the unmistakable sound of a motorboat engine starting up somewhere above them. Marcus Cromwell hadn't just brought men with guns, he'd brought equipment for his own underwater recovery operation. "New plan," Clara said, making a decision that surprised herself with its boldness. "We surface right here, right now, and we face whatever's waiting for us on shore." "Clara, that's suicide. They have weapons and we're defenseless in the water." "Not defenseless," Clara replied, remembering something Uncle Jasper had written in his journal. "Elias, are you listening?" "I'm here, Mom. I need you to call Sheriff Bradley right now. Tell him there are armed men threatening us on our own property. Tell him we need help immediately." "Already did," Elias said with 7-year-old pride, "when I saw the bad men coming through the trees." Clara and Ray surfaced together 50 feet from shore, the Confederate strongbox floating between them supported by the lifting bags. On the shoreline, Clara could see Marcus Cromwell and 5 other men, 3 of whom were clearly carrying weapons. "Mrs. Myles," Marcus called across the water, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting his way. "I think it's time we discussed the terms of our partnership." "I don't think we have anything to discuss," Clara called back, treading water beside the treasure that represented her son's future. "You're in the middle of a lake with nowhere to go, and I have 6 men on shore who are very motivated to protect my family's interests. I think we have plenty to discuss." Clara was about to respond when she heard the most beautiful sound of her life, the distant wail of police sirens growing steadily louder. Sheriff Bradley was coming, and he was bringing backup. Marcus Cromwell heard the sirens too. His confident demeanor flickered as he realized his intimidation tactics had just become criminal assault charges if he pressed his advantage. "This isn't over, Mrs. Myles," he called across the water. "Legal documents can be challenged. Trust funds can be broken, and some things are worth more than money. As the sirens grew louder, Marcus and his associates melted back into the forest like shadows, leaving Clara and Ray alone in the water with $1 million worth of Civil War treasure floating between them. "Mom!" Elias's voice carried clearly, across the dark water. "Are you okay?" Clara looked at the strongbox bobbing in the gentle waves, then at Ray's relieved face in the glow of their diving lights, then at the cabin where her son was waiting for them to come home safely. "We're okay, baby," she called back. "We're coming home." Sheriff Bradley arrived with 3 deputies and floodlights that turned Deadman's Hollow into something resembling a crime scene. As Clara and Ray brought the Confederate strongbox to shore, the law enforcement officers secured the area and began documenting what had clearly been an attempted armed robbery. "Mrs. Myles, are you injured?" Sheriff Bradley asked as Clara climbed out of the water, still wearing her diving gear. "We're fine. But Marcus Cromwell and his associates were here with weapons, threatening us while we conducted legal archaeological recovery on our own property." Sheriff Bradley examined the strongbox with professional interest. "And this is what they were after? This and several other containers we've located underwater, Civil War-era treasure that was hidden here in 1883. Clara showed him Uncle Jasper's legal documents, now safely sealed in waterproof containers. "These establish our legal right to anything we recover." While the sheriff reviewed the paperwork, Ray coordinated with the deputies to bring up the remaining containers from the lake bed. The recovery operation that had started as a desperate midnight treasure hunt was now proceeding under official law enforcement supervision. "We've got probable cause to search for Marcus Cromwell based on your description of the armed confrontation," Sheriff Bradley told Clara. "But I need you to understand something. The Cromwell family has connections throughout this county. They're going to fight your claim to this treasure with every legal resource they have." "Let them fight," Clara said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "We have right on our side." As dawn broke over the mountains, Clara found herself standing on the shore of Deadman's Hollow, surrounded by treasure that represented more money than she'd ever imagined possessing. The Confederate strongbox alone contained gold coins and bullion worth over $1 million. The smaller containers held additional precious metals, historical documents, and artifacts that would be invaluable to legitimate museums and historians. But the most important discovery was Uncle Jasper's final message to his heir. Hidden in the bottom of his personal container was a letter addressed to David's family, in Uncle Jasper's careful handwriting. Clara read it aloud to Elias, while Ray and the deputies catalogued the other recovered items. "My dear relatives," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I have passed on, and you have found what I spent 40 years searching for. This treasure belongs to you by right of inheritance, but more importantly, it belongs to you because you understand what it represents. This gold was stolen from the people of the South during their darkest hour and hidden by men who cared more about profit than principle. It does not belong to organizations that want to use it to promote hatred or division. It belongs to people who understand that history should be preserved honestly, without romanticism or revision. Use this treasure wisely. Use it to build a better life for your children. And if anyone tries to take it from you, remember that some things are worth fighting for." Elias listened to every word, with the serious attention he brought to all important family matters. When Clara finished reading, he looked up at her with eyes that seemed older than his 7 years. "Uncle Jasper was a good man, wasn't he?" "Yes, baby. He was a very good man who wanted to make sure we were taken care of." The morning brought more complications. Marcus Cromwell arrived with his own lawyer, a man in an expensive suit who carried a briefcase full of legal challenges to Clara's claim. But he also brought something unexpected, an offer that made Clara reconsider everything. "Mrs. Myles," the lawyer said as they gathered around the kitchen table in the cabin, "my client is prepared to purchase your treasure claim for $2 million cash. No legal battles, no complications, no delays. You sign over your rights." to the recovered materials, and you walk away with more money than most people see in a lifetime. Clara looked at the contract they'd prepared. It was legitimate, generous, and would solve every financial problem she'd ever had. Elias would have college money, they could buy a real home, and she'd never have to worry about paying bills again. "What happens to the treasure if I accept your offer?" Clara asked. "It becomes part of the Cromwell Foundation's historical collection, where it will be properly preserved and displayed." "Displayed how? And where?" The lawyer exchanged glances with Marcus before answering. "As part of a comprehensive exhibition about Southern heritage and the economic impact of Northern aggression during the Reconstruction period." Clara understood immediately what that meant. The treasure would become propaganda, used to promote a version of history that painted the Civil War as Northern oppression rather than a fight to end slavery. "I need time to think about your offer," Clara said. "Of course, but please understand that this is a limited-time proposal. If you choose to fight our historical claims in court, the legal costs alone could consume any potential profits from your discovery." After the lawyer left, Clara sat on the porch with Elias and Ray, watching the morning sun sparkle on the water of Deadman's Hollow. $2 million was life-changing money, but accepting it would mean betraying Uncle Jasper's trust and everything he'd believed about preserving history honestly. "What do you think, baby?" Clara asked her son. "Should we take their money?" Elias was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Uncle Jasper's ghost says the treasure belongs to us," he said finally. "And that means we get to decide what happens to it, not the bad men." Clara hugged her son close and made a decision that would change their lives forever. "You're right, baby. It's ours to decide." Clara's rejection of the Cromwell offer triggered a legal war that lasted 3 months and consumed most of her waking thoughts. Marcus Cromwell's foundation filed injunctions, historical claims, and mineral rights disputes that challenged every aspect of her ownership of the recovered treasure. But Clara had advantages that previous treasure hunters had lacked. Uncle Jasper's meticulous legal preparations and the support of people who believed in preserving history honestly. Ray Dalton proved to be more than just an academic ally. His connections in the historical preservation community brought Clara access to lawyers who specialized in archaeological law and understood the complexities of Civil War treasure recovery. More importantly, his documentation of the recovery process provided the kind of detailed provenance that legitimate museums required. "The key to our legal position," Clara's lawyer explained during one of their strategy sessions, "is that we can prove chain of custody from the original 1883 concealment to the present day. Uncle Jasper's research creates an unbroken historical record that establishes your client's claim beyond reasonable doubt." Martha Hendricks emerged as an unexpected but powerful advocate. Her decades of experience as the county's head librarian had given her access to historical records that even the Cromwell family's lawyers couldn't match. When Marcus's legal team tried to establish their great-great-grandfather's partnership with Morrison, Martha produced county records showing that the original partnership had been dissolved before the treasure was hidden. Samuel Cromwell sold his interest in the transport operation 6 months before the gold was concealed at Deadman's Hollow, Martha testified during the preliminary hearing. "I have the original bill of sale, properly notarized and filed with the county clerk in 1883, but the legal battles were expensive and emotionally draining." Clara found herself driving to town 3 days a week for meetings with lawyers, court appearances, and depositions that required her to defend every aspect of her treasure hunting activities. The stress was taking a toll on both her and Elias. "Mom, why can't the bad men just leave us alone?" Elias asked one evening as Clara reviewed legal documents at the kitchen table. "Because they think the treasure belongs to them, and they're willing to fight for it, but Uncle Jasper said it belongs to us." Clara looked at her son's serious face and made a decision that surprised her lawyers and terrified her accountant. "Elias, what would you think if we gave some of the treasure to a museum? Not to the bad men, but to people who would take care of it properly. Would we still have enough money for college and a real house?" "We'd have more than enough." Elias considered this with the careful thought he brought to all important decisions. "I think Uncle Jasper would like that. He wanted the old things, to be in a place where people could learn about them." Clara's donation of half the recovered treasure to the Smithsonian Institution changed everything about the legal dispute. Suddenly, she wasn't just a treasure hunter trying to keep valuable artifacts for personal profit. She was a historical preservationist, ensuring that Civil War artifacts would be properly studied and displayed for future generations. The donation also provided her with powerful allies. The Smithsonian's legal team joined her case as interested parties, bringing resources and expertise that Marcus Cromwell's foundation couldn't match. More importantly, the museum's involvement brought national media attention that exposed the Cromwell Foundation's controversial political agenda. The final confrontation came during a court hearing that drew reporters from 3 states. Marcus. Cromwell took the witness stand to argue his family's historical claim to the treasure, but his testimony fell apart under cross-examination when Clara's lawyer introduced evidence of the Foundation's ties to organizations that promoted Confederate revisionist history. "Mr. Cromwell," the lawyer asked, "is it true that your foundation has funded monuments that refer to enslaved people as workers and the Civil War as the War of Northern Aggression?" "Our foundation supports historical accuracy, including the historical accuracy that slavery was beneficial to African Americans and that the Confederacy fought for states' rights rather than the preservation of slavery." Marcus's answer was evasive and unconvincing. When he left the witness stand, Clara could see that he'd lost both the legal argument and the public relations battle. Judge Catherine Morrison. No relation to the historical Morrison who'd hidden the treasure, delivered her verdict with the measured authority of someone who understood the broader implications of her decision. This court finds that the recovered artifacts legally belong to Mrs. Clara Myles as the heir to property where they were discovered. Furthermore, this court commends Mrs. Myles for her decision to donate a significant portion of the treasure to the Smithsonian Institution, ensuring that these historically significant artifacts will be preserved and displayed for educational purposes. The judge's final words addressed the courtroom full of reporters and interested observers. "Let this case serve as an example that our historical artifacts belong not to those who would use them to promote political agendas, but to all Americans who seek to understand our past honestly and completely." As Clara left the courthouse with Elias and Ray, she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she'd been carrying since the day they first arrived at Deadman's Hollow. The treasure was legally theirs. The Cromwell Foundation's claims had been rejected, and half of the recovered gold was already on its way to Washington, D.C., where it would be studied by historians and displayed for millions of visitors. "Mum," Elias said as they walked to their car, "Uncle Jasper's ghost says thank you." Clara smiled and squeezed her son's hand. "Tell him he's welcome." 6 months after the court decision, Clara stood on the newly built deck overlooking Deadman's Hollow and marveled at how much their lives had changed. The lake that had once seemed like a burden was now the centerpiece of a home that felt like something from a magazine, beautiful but comfortable, substantial but not ostentatious. The treasure recovery had yielded enough money to transform their circumstances completely, while still funding Elias's education through graduate school and beyond. But more importantly, it had given them something Clara had thought was lost forever, a sense of security and belonging that allowed them to build a real life rather than simply surviving from one crisis to the next. "Mom, the museum people are here," Elias called from the front yard where he'd been watching for their expected visitors. Clara walked around to greet Dr. Sarah Chen from the Smithsonian and her team of researchers who had come to conduct follow-up interviews about the treasure. Discovery? Their work over the past months had revealed details about the 1883 concealment operation that even Uncle Jasper's research hadn't uncovered. "Mrs. Myles, we have some exciting news to share," Dr. Chen said, as they settled on the deck with coffee and the kind of homemade cookies that Clara now had time to bake. "Our analysis of the recovered artifacts has confirmed that this was indeed the lost treasury reserve from Richmond. The historical significance extends far beyond the monetary value." She opened a folder containing photographs and documents that told the complete story of Morrison's transport operation. "Your Uncle Jasper was right about almost everything, but he didn't realize the full scope of what was hidden here. The gold represents the last Confederate government funds that were never recovered after the war." Elias listened to the presentation with the intense attention he brought to all subjects that captured his imagination. At 9 years old, he'd become something of a local celebrity as the boy who'd found Civil War treasure in his backyard lake. But he wore his fame lightly, more interested in the historical mysteries than the media attention. "Dr. Chen," Elias said during a pause in the presentation, "will you put up a sign at the museum that says Uncle Jasper helped find the treasure? He looked for it for a really long time." "Absolutely. Jasper Greyrock will be prominently credited in our exhibition. His 40 years of research made your family's discovery possible." Ray Dalton had become a permanent fixture in their lives, officially as Clara's partner in the historical preservation consulting business they'd established, and unofficially as the closest thing to a grandfather that Elias had ever known. Their business specialized in helping other families navigate the complex legal and historical issues surrounding archaeological discoveries on private property. "We've had 12 inquiries this month," Ray reported as the Smithsonian team finished their interviews. "Apparently your success has inspired a lot of people to take another look at family stories about buried treasure." Clara smiled. "Let's hope they're better prepared for the complications than we were." The success of their treasure recovery had attracted attention from beyond the academic community. 3 different production companies wanted to make movies about their story. 2 publishers were competing for book rights, and the History Channel had already aired a documentary that made Clara uncomfortable with its focus on the dramatic confrontations rather than the historical significance of their discovery. But the attention had also brought opportunities to make a real difference. Clara had established a foundation that provided grants to legitimate historical preservation projects, particularly those focused on underrepresented perspectives on Civil War history. The irony wasn't lost on her that Confederate gold was now funding efforts to ensure that the experiences of enslaved people and freed slaves would be preserved and honored. "Mom, can we show Dr. Chen the new things I found?" Elias asked as the formal interview concluded. Over the past months, Elias's intuitive connection to the lake had led to the discovery of additional artifacts. Nothing as valuable as the main treasure cache, but historically significant items that filled in details about the 1883 concealment operation. His ability to sense buried objects had been documented by the Smithsonian team and was now the subject of academic papers about the role of intuition in archaeological discovery. Elias has identified 3 additional sites that appear to contain artifacts from the Morrison transport operation, Dr. Chen explained as they walked down to the lake. "We're planning a comprehensive excavation next summer that will hopefully recover the complete historical record." Clara watched her son wade into the shallow water with the confidence of a child who'd never learned to fear the place that had nearly destroyed their lives. Deadman's Hollow was no longer a source of anxiety and danger. It had become their home, their livelihood, and the foundation of a future she was still learning to believe in. As the sun set behind the mountains, Clara found herself standing at the water's edge, with the same sense of possibility that had first drawn Elias to explore the lake's mysteries. But now, the possibilities were grounded in reality rather than desperate hope. Martha Hendricks had become a regular dinner guest, bringing new historical documents and stories that added depth to their understanding of the area's past. Sheriff Bradley stopped by monthly to check on their security and share updates about Marcus Cromwell's various legal appeals, all of which had been unsuccessful. "Mrs. Myles," Dr. Chen said as her team prepared to leave, "I want you to know that your decision to donate half the treasure to the museum has had impacts far beyond what you probably realize. The exhibition we're planning will reach millions of visitors and help them understand this period of history in ways that previous displays never could." That evening, Clara sat in Uncle Jasper's rocking chair, watching Elias skip stones across the dark water of their lake. The boy who'd found Civil War treasure had grown into a confident child who understood that some discoveries were more important than money. "Mom," Elias said as he climbed onto her lap with the easy affection of a child who'd never doubted his security. "Uncle Jasper's ghost says he's proud of what we did with his treasure." Clara hugged her son close and looked out at the water that had changed their lives. "Tell him we're proud of him too, and tell him thank you for bringing us home." The lake reflected the stars emerging in the darkening sky, holding secrets that would continue to reveal themselves to people patient enough to listen. But for Clara and Elias, the most important discovery had already been made. They'd found their place in the world, and it was exactly where they belonged,